Online Lecture Series, Number 3, The Civil War and Reconstruction. The Civil War was easily America's darkest moment. In its 4-year duration, the war nearly tore apart the 80-year-old Union. It would kill more Americans than all other wars people on this nation fought combined, and cost the United States previously unimaginable sums of money. The Civil War would answer long-held questions about where supreme power lies, with the states or with the national government. It would end the legalization of slavery forever on American shores. It would also address the long-contested issue of nullification, as states learned that they do not, in fact, have the right to secede from the Union. As with all momentous occasions in history, however, it would also raise new questions, which we shall address later. As we've learned, the seeds for civil war were sown even before our nation was born. Slavery and the southern states' economic dependency upon it created a vast, glaring division in our nation that came to full light the decade prior to the Civil War, as compromise over which states came into the Union as slave or free seemed no longer manageable. By the 1850s, a hard line was drawn across our nation at the Mason-Dixon line, separating those who wanted to see slavery contained in the South, if not abolished altogether, from those who wanted to see slavery and their agricultural empire spread. Despite the fact that it was clearly the South's interest that was in control of Congress, the presidency, and by default the Supreme Court, Southern states knew that their control of the national government was rapidly dwindling. Thanks to the growth of the Industrial Revolution in northern states, the North had attracted tremendous immigration from Germany and Ireland as more and more jobs and land became available. The South's population was remaining relatively stagnant except for its slave population, which had grown to a staggering 4 million persons in servitude by 1860. Those slaves, however, were not adding the same quantity of congressional representation that the white immigrants to the North were adding over the last 2 decades. By the time the South seceded and fighting began at Bull Run, just west of Washington, D.C. in 1861, it was clear that the South was greatly outmatched. Because of immigration and industrialization, the North could recruit 4 soldiers to every one in the South, and the North could outproduce the South 32-1 in firearms, 25-1 in naval ships, and 15-1 in iron production. The South did hold one advantage over the North, however: General Robert E. Lee. Lee, a relative through marriage of George and Martha Washington, had served the U.S. Army for 32 years prior to the Civil War. Lee had received a classical education as a child and distinguished himself as the only first-year student at the United States Military Academy who had earned the rank of sergeant by the end of his first year. He served with distinction in the Mexican-American War and quickly gained a reputation as a creative and unconventional leader, someone who knew the textbook tactics taught in school as well as anybody, but could also improvise upon them so well that his opponents found him to be quite unpredictable. Fighting during the Civil War occurred across many fronts, mostly in the South. The Union, numerically superior with far more war material than the South, was able to establish a naval blockade across the South from Virginia down to mid-Florida and between western Florida through Texas. This served to both cut the South off from trade with any sympathetic foreign nations. For instance, a cotton-starved England had once considered trading with the South, as well as to allow the North easy access to the Mississippi River. This access allowed northern troop transports to deliver soldiers all along Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. By 1863, it had seemed that the Union had the South surrounded from all directions with a much larger, better-equipped army. By all rights, the North should have won the war in less than 2 years. That the war dragged on until 1865 is as much a testament to General Lee's talented leadership, often snapping victory from the jaws of defeat and continually confounding the Union, who knew that he had to be taken out of the battle were they to win, as it was to the continued bungling of Union leadership. In 1863, Lincoln was just a year away from facing re-election, and his prospects did not look promising. Like most people caught in a long and bloody war, Northerners were beginning to cry loudly that they wanted an end to the fighting as soon as possible. The draft instituted by the Union and Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, which is the power to arrest and hold people indefinitely without charging them for any crime, made him increasingly unpopular in his home turf. In March of 1864, Lincoln appointed General Ulysses S. Grant as commander of all Union armies. Grant had shown some talent and tenacity for battle earlier in the war, and with his promotion, he also brought up William Tecumseh Sherman as commander of the Mississippi branch of the battle. Perhaps more of an indication of how desperate he was, as opposed to being the great humanitarian history later chose to recognize him as, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation declared that slaves in all rebelling territories, and only the rebelling territories, were immediately free. Lincoln hoped to incite these former slaves to take up arms and revolt against their masters. Perhaps unintentionally, however, he had made the Civil War a war to liberate American slaves. Despite the fact the proclamation only applied to slaves in rebelling states, soon as many as 20% of slaves in Union territories had fled captivity, claiming freedom on their own. Now, despite the fact that the South was clearly losing the war by 1864, it showed no sign of surrender, and in fact had fought harder and harder as hope for victory became more and more distant. Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman all agreed that the South's spirit was keeping it in the war, an unwavering feeling of the righteousness of its fight. All three leaders felt that breaking the spirit of the South was going to be crucial if they were to attain a surrender from the Confederates. At this point, the fighting in the Civil War became truly brutal. General Sherman embarked from western Mississippi with his army of tens of thousands, and growing larger each week with troop deliveries, on a path of heretofore unrealized destruction. Called Sherman's March to the Sea, General Sherman and his army cut a clear path straight across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, destroying nearly everything in its path, including entire cities such as Atlanta, as vividly depicted in the 1939 Civil War epic film Gone with the Wind. Sherman's March to the Sea targeted civilians, specifically by destroying southern towns, plantations, and homes, all in an effort to break the civilians' desire to support the Confederacy's will to fight. Now, despite the brutality of this conflict, Sherman's plan had greatly succeeded as support from deeper southern states had quickly died off, leaving Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas to fend for themselves. Lee's army was caught between Grant's north and Sherman's control of the south, and room to run, hide, and fight was quickly dwindling.